He dumped the girl, not knowing she was expecting twins with him. A few months later, the mother revealed a secret that turned everything upside down. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun spilled over the city of Chicago, touching glass skyscrapers and brownstone alleys with the same indifference. From the penthouse suite of RMC Holdings' downtown headquarters, Michael Reeves stood before a wall of windows, his gaze lost in the endless grid of streets below. To most, he was the embodiment of success. Heir to a multi-billion-dollar financial empire, educated at Princeton, fluent in the language of mergers and power. But behind his well-tailored suits and confident charm lay a weariness that not even wealth could conceal. He was 30, and yet he felt older, worn down by years of facades, hollow conversations, and relationships that crumbled the moment the illusion of riches was stripped away. The office buzzed behind him. His assistant, Claire, stepped in to remind him of a meeting with a European partner, but he waved it off. Lately, his patience for business dealings had thinned. It wasn't the numbers or strategy that exhausted him. It was the performative nature of it all. Meetings where people smiled too much, nodded too often, and said what they thought he wanted to hear. He had everything he was supposed to want: an estate in the suburbs, invitations to every gala, and a father who was grooming him to be the next face of RMC. Yet, each passing day, the life he was living felt less like his own. It had started years ago. Every woman he dated seemed to wear a mask, one that only cracked when gifts weren't lavish enough or vacations weren't first class. Michael had grown cynical. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for sincerity, for someone who would see him without the glitter and stay anyway. But in his world, sincerity was a rare commodity. That night, sitting alone in his luxury condo surrounded by silence, Michael felt the weight of his loneliness press heavier than usual. He poured himself a drink, walked past the imported furniture, and stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back at him didn't look happy. That was when the idea came. Not in a flash, but in a slow, determined wave. If the world wouldn't show him truth, he would have to go looking for it. Not as Michael Reeves, CEO in waiting, but as someone else entirely. The next morning, he drove to a part of town he'd never needed to visit before. He bought a weathered Ford Transit van with a few dents and too many miles. The seller warned him about a sputtering engine, but Michael only nodded. It was perfect. He registered it under a new identity, Mike Savage, and applied to work for a local delivery service that promised fast food and faster paychecks. No background checks, no questions. He left his condo under the pretense of travel, telling his parents he'd be in Denver for several weeks exploring new partnerships. His father barely looked up from his emails. His mother seemed mildly surprised but accepted the explanation. With a duffel bag of thrifted clothes and a prepaid phone, Michael moved into a modest apartment on the south side. The building was old, the walls thin, and the water temperamental, but for the first time in years he felt anonymous. The early days were strange. Michael adjusted to a world without concierge services and private elevators. He stood in line at laundromats, cooked simple meals, and cursed quietly when the van refused to start in the cold. The work was physically tiring, lifting crates, navigating narrow alleys, surviving long hours in traffic, but it grounded him. The customers barely looked at him. Some mumbled thank yous. Most ignored him entirely. It was humbling. No one cared who he was. He was just the delivery guy. It was during one of his late shifts that he first saw her. The order was small: 2 sandwiches and soup from a cafe called Page Turner's, tucked between a thrift store and a pawn shop in Logan Square. He walked in, cold air trailing behind him, and approached the counter where a young woman was arguing quietly with the manager. She wore a faded green apron and held a plastic bag in one hand. Her expression was tense but composed. "I just need to drop it off at my house," she was saying. "They haven't eaten since this morning. I'll come right back." The manager shook his head. "We've got 2 staff on floor. You leave, we fall behind. Not my problem." Michael set the delivery bag down and glanced at her. She was in her mid-20s, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes alert despite the dark circles beneath them. She sighed, then looked at him and forced a small smile. "Give me a sec." She rang up the order, but her card was declined. Twice. She stared at the screen, muttered something under her breath, then began to remove items from the bag. "I'll take care of it," Michael said quietly, sliding a bill across the counter. She looked at him sharply. "You don't have to." "I know." He nodded toward the bag. "They probably need it more than I do." There was a pause. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly, and handed him the food. "Thanks." He left without another word, but her image lingered. That night, lying on a squeaky mattress in his freezing apartment, he couldn't shake her from his mind. She hadn't flirted. She hadn't batted her lashes or asked his name. She had simply tried to get food home to someone she cared about. That kind of quiet resilience stirred something in him. In the following days, Michael found himself requesting delivery routes near that part of the city. He returned to Page Turner's more often, sometimes with real orders, sometimes just grabbing a coffee. The woman, he learned her name was Haley, was always there, always working. They exchanged small talk that slowly stretched into longer conversations. She told him about her younger brothers, about her late mother who had passed from cancer 2 years ago, about her father who left when she was 10. She never complained, never asked for pity. She simply told the truth. Haley lived in a small rental apartment with her siblings, balancing 2 jobs while managing school schedules and doctor visits. She took pride in doing everything herself. Michael, listening from the other side of the counter, felt something shift inside him. He admired her in a way he hadn't admired anyone in years. Not because she was strong in the way people pretended to be, but because she had no choice and met it head-on anyway. As winter deepened, their conversations turned more personal. Michael told her vague stories about growing up in another part of the state, how he didn't talk to his parents much anymore, how he was figuring things out. She didn't press for more. Once she offered him a free muffin, and when he hesitated, she shrugged. "You're one of the good ones," she said simply. It had been a long time since someone had said that to him without knowing his name. One Friday evening, Michael lingered after his shift waiting for the cafe to close. Haley sat across from him in a back booth, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. "You don't talk like most of the drivers," she said, studying him. "You notice things. You listen." He smiled. "Maybe I used to be someone else." She laughed. "A secret agent?" "Something like that." That moment, quiet, unforced, was when he realized he was falling for her. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he was lying by omission. But he couldn't stop. Haley didn't see him through the lens of wealth or power. She didn't see him as a paycheck or opportunity. She saw him. And that was all he had wanted for so long. Every day he spent as Mike Savage, the closer he felt to the man he was supposed to be. His past life, the luxury condos, the boardrooms, the business alliances, faded into the background. All that mattered was the woman across the table and the fragile, honest connection growing between them. But time had a way of catching up. Michael knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. With each passing day, the guilt weighed heavier. He couldn't bear the thought of hurting her, but he also couldn't imagine a life built on deceit. Something had to give. As snow began to fall across Chicago and the city lit up with holiday lights, Michael stood at a quiet intersection near Haley's apartment, his breath clouding the air. His delivery bag rested on his shoulder, but his thoughts were far away. He would have to tell her everything. And when he did, he would find out whether what they had was real, or just another illusion in a world he had tried so desperately to escape. Chapter 2. Choice and Consequence. The wind that swept through Chicago in January bit deeper than the cold of December had. Streets gleamed with slush, and storefronts blinked with weary post-holiday lights. Michael stood outside Page Turner's on a quiet Sunday evening, his breath coming in short clouds. The warmth of the cafe windows spilled onto the sidewalk, casting a golden glow that contrasted sharply with the muted gray of the sky. Inside, Haley was closing up, stacking books into a crate with her usual focused grace, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her hair tucked behind one ear. She hadn't seen him yet. He hesitated. For weeks now, he had rehearsed what he would say. Every version felt inadequate. There were too many pieces to the truth, too many risks. But the longer he waited, the worse it felt. Haley deserved honesty. She had given him nothing but that from the beginning, and if he was serious about building something real with her, he had to come clean. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up with a smile. She waved him in, and he stepped into the warmth, shaking off the cold. "You're late," she teased lightly. "No deliveries today?" "Just one," he said, his voice softer than usual, but not the kind that fits in a bag. She raised an eyebrow, then turned to finish packing the crate. "Well, that sounds mysterious. Should I be worried?" He moved closer, pulling off his gloves. "No, I need to talk to you, really talk." Haley glanced at him, registering the seriousness in his tone. She walked to the front, locked the door, and flipped the sign to closed. Then she sat across from him at their usual booth. He took a deep breath, searching for the right way to begin. "My name isn't Mike Savage." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't speak. "My real name is Michael Reeves. I'm the son of Henry Reeves, the CEO of RMC Holdings." The silence that followed felt like an avalanche had just landed between them. "I've been lying to you," he continued, "not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how else to find someone like you. Someone who sees me without all the noise, the name, the money, the expectations." Haley didn't flinch, didn't cry out. She just sat there watching him, her face unreadable. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. And then I met you. You never asked for anything. You just were." When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "So this whole time you were testing me?" "No," he said quickly. "At first, maybe I was. But after I met you, it stopped being about any plan. I stayed because I wanted to be near you, because I loved the way you never pretended, never performed. I fell for you, and I still am." Haley leaned back, folding her arms. Her expression softened, though her eyes remained cautious. "I should be angry," she said, "but I'm not. I'm just tired. Tired of people hiding things. Tired of always feeling like I'm on the outside." Michael reached across the table, taking her hand. "I don't want to hide anymore. I want you to know everything. I want us to be real." She looked at him for a long time, and then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't a fairy tale resolution. But it was enough, for now. In the days that followed, Michael introduced Haley to his world piece by piece. She visited his downtown condo, sat in on one of his meetings just to observe, and met Claire, his assistant, who was too stunned to say anything, but it's about time. Haley never asked for gifts or favors. She remained who she was, independent, steady, cautious. Michael's parents, however, were not as composed. The invitation to dinner at the Reeves estate in Lincoln Park came in a formal envelope, embossed and hand-delivered by the family driver. Haley held it in her hands like it might burn her fingers. Michael assured her it wasn't an ambush, though he couldn't guarantee his father's reaction. The night of the dinner, Haley wore a navy dress borrowed from a friend. Her hair was tied simply, her makeup minimal. Michael wore a tailored blazer but no tie, hoping to set a tone of calm. When they arrived, the house stood like a fortress, grand, cold, immaculate. Inside, the air was heavy with formality. Henry Reeves stood near the fireplace, scotch in hand, while Margaret, Michael's mother, offered a tight-lipped smile. Haley greeted them politely, her voice steady. She didn't fidget or shrink, even as Henry's eyes scanned her like she were a resume he was prepared to reject. Dinner was served in silence at first. The table stretched long and bare between them. The food was exquisite, prepared by a private chef, but no one seemed to be eating. Finally, Henry spoke. "Michael tells me you're raising your brothers alone. That's admirable." There was a tone to the word that made it anything but a compliment. Haley nodded. "They're good kids. I'm lucky to have them." Henry swirled his glass. "And what is it you do when you're not waitressing?" "I work part-time at a cafe and at the library on weekends," she said. "I also help with community literacy programs." Margaret made a small noise in her throat, one that might have been surprise or disapproval. Henry leaned back, his gaze shifting to Michael. "You really think this is what's best for your future?" Michael set his fork down. "I think she's the best thing that's ever happened to me." "But she doesn't come from our world," Henry snapped. "She doesn't understand what's required, the pressure, the image, the alliances we've built over decades." "She understands more than you think," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "She understands loyalty, resilience, integrity." Henry stood. "Love is a feeling. Business is survival. You can't run a company on feelings." "I'm not trying to run a company with her. I'm trying to build a life." Margaret touched Henry's arm, trying to ease him back into his seat. But the tension was thick and the message was clear. The dinner ended without resolution. On the way home, Haley didn't speak. Michael reached for her hand, and she let him hold it, but the silence between them was not the same as before. The following week, Henry confronted Michael privately. In his office, surrounded by polished wood and glass awards, he laid down the final blow. "If you stay with her, you'll lose everything. Your seat on the board, your trust fund, your inheritance. I've arranged for you to marry Samantha Green. Her family is essential to our next merger. You walk away from that, you walk away from all of it." Michael stared at him, stunned by the ultimatum. "She's not a deal," he said finally. "She's a person. And you're about to become irrelevant," Henry replied coldly. "Think carefully, son." Michael didn't answer. He left the office and drove for hours, winding through neighborhoods both familiar and foreign. He found himself parked outside Haley's building just after midnight. She opened the door in pajamas, her face worried. He stepped inside, sat on the couch, and told her everything. She listened quietly, Then, to his heartbreak, she spoke with painful calm. "You have to go back." He shook his head. "I'm not giving up on us." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I'm asking you to choose a future where you don't have to resent me every time something falls apart. I can't be the reason you lose everything. I'd rather lose it all than lose you." She reached out, brushing his cheek with her fingers. "And I love you for that, but I won't let you do it." In the morning, she was gone. A note on the table read, "Please don't look for me. Take care of yourself." Michael didn't go to work. He didn't call his parents. He sat on the couch for hours, staring at the note. Haley, meanwhile, was sitting in a doctor's office miles away, her hands trembling. She had gone in to check on the exhaustion and nausea that had worsened over the past few weeks. The doctor's words were clear, but her mind struggled to catch up. She was pregnant, 8 weeks along, possibly more. The room spun, and she steadied herself against the sink. The nurse asked if she wanted to call anyone. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "There's no one." But that wasn't true. There was Michael, and he was the father of the life growing inside her. She walked out of the clinic into the bitter cold, clutching her coat tightly around her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, her heart torn between longing and fear. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew one thing with certainty. She couldn't go back. Not yet. Chapter 3. Truth, Forgiveness, and New Beginning. Spring arrived in Chicago as a quiet visitor, softening the ice-lined streets and brushing color back into the parks and sidewalks. The city shook off its frozen weight, and life began to breathe again. For Michael Reeves, however, the season brought little relief. Months had passed since Haley had disappeared from his life, leaving only a note and a silence that grew louder each day. He had returned home, but nothing felt like home anymore. His father welcomed him back into the fold with the cold satisfaction of a general reclaiming a fallen soldier. Michael was reinstated into the company, reassumed his position on the board, and was publicly seen again at the firm's annual gala, this time with Samantha Green on his arm. She smiled for the cameras, flashed her diamond engagement ring, and carried herself with the grace of someone who had always expected to be the center of attention. But behind closed doors, their relationship was as hollow as the crystal goblets clinking at their engagement party. Michael tried. He tried to be present, to act the part, to nod in meetings and contribute to decisions. But his heart wasn't in it. Every morning began with the same ache, the same memory of Haley's eyes, the warmth of her hand, the sound of her voice when she laughed softly at his stories. Her absence clung to him like fog, and though he searched for her quietly, through old neighborhoods and familiar cafes, she had vanished. What he didn't know was that just a few miles away, Haley was living in the quietest corner of the city, in a worn apartment with uneven floors and flickering lights. She worked odd hours at a grocery store and spent her nights alone, often talking softly to the growing life inside her belly. Her body had changed quickly, faster than expected, and during her second prenatal checkup the nurse confirmed what she had suspected. Twins. She had smiled through the shock, her fingers trembling as she touched her stomach. A boy and a girl, the nurse had said, 2 heartbeats steady and strong. Haley had cried the entire bus ride home, unsure if it was joy or fear spilling down her cheeks. She never told Michael. At night, she would sit by the window, staring into the streetlights, wondering if he would have wanted to know. She imagined what he would have said, what he would have done, But every time she came close to picking up the phone, she stopped herself. He was engaged now. He had returned to the life he was meant for. She couldn't drag him back into hers, not when his world had already made it clear that she didn't belong. It was during a quiet Thursday morning at a crowded farmer's market that everything changed. Margaret Reeves had always loved early markets. There was something soothing about wandering through stalls before the city truly woke, about touching produce with her own hands and exchanging brief conversations with strangers who didn't know her last name. It reminded her of the years before money turned every interaction into a negotiation. That morning, she moved from table to table, a woven basket hanging from her arm, and then, just beyond a stand of strawberries, she saw a young woman standing alone, her hand resting on her visibly pregnant stomach, her face pale beneath the morning sun. Haley. Margaret froze, her breath catching. Her instinct was to turn away, to disappear before she was seen. But something rooted her to the ground. Haley looked thinner, her clothes looser, her shoes worn. There were shadows under her eyes and a heaviness in the way she stood that made Margaret's throat tighten. She stepped forward before she could think. "Haley?" she asked gently. Haley looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Mrs. Reeves," Haley said quietly. "I didn't expect—" Margaret shook her head, taking in the sight before her. "You're pregnant." Haley's lips parted, then closed again. She nodded. "Is it—" Margaret's voice faltered, but she knew the answer. "Michael's?" A pause, then a whisper. "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the wave of guilt crashing through her. "You've been alone all this time?" "I didn't want to cause trouble," Haley said, looking away. "I thought it was better this way." "No," Margaret said firmly, stepping closer. "This isn't right. This should never have happened." Haley tried to smile, but her hands were shaking. Without hesitation, Margaret took her by the arm. "Come with me. Please. Let me do something right." Later that day, Haley stood in the doorway of one of the Reeves' unused properties, a spacious home in the northern suburbs with tall windows and soft, clean air. It had stood empty for years, used only for guests or short stays. Margaret walked her through every room, pointing out where the nursery could be, how the sun hit the kitchen table just right in the mornings, how there was a garden she could tend if she liked. "I want you here," Margaret said. "No arguments." Haley, overwhelmed and still unsure, agreed. That night, as she lay in a real bed with clean sheets and felt the quiet rhythm of the babies inside her, she allowed herself, for the first time in months, to hope. Margaret didn't tell her husband. She didn't tell Michael. Instead, she visited Haley every few days, bringing groceries, baby clothes, updates from the outside world. She watched as Haley grew stronger, watched the apartment fill with the quiet anticipation of life. And when the time came, when the contractions began on a rainy afternoon, Margaret was there to drive her to the hospital. The twins were born in the early hours of a Monday morning. A boy and a girl. Healthy, perfect. Haley held them close to her chest and cried, her tears soaking the tiny caps on their heads. Margaret stood by the window, silent, her heart swelling in a way she hadn't felt in years. When the babies were settled in their cribs and Haley drifted to sleep, Margaret stepped into the hallway and made a decision. It was time. The next morning, she walked into Michael's study with a calm resolve. "I need you to come with me," she said. Michael, bleary-eyed from another sleepless night, looked up. "What's going on?" "Just come." They drove in silence. Michael asked questions, but she didn't answer. When they arrived at the hospital and Margaret led him through the hallways, his heart began to pound. He stopped just outside the room, unsure of what he was about to see. Margaret opened the door. Inside, Haley sat in bed, pale but glowing, holding two sleeping infants in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide, uncertain. Michael froze. Margaret stepped aside, her voice barely a whisper. "They're yours." Time stopped. The fluorescent lights above flickered. The machines hummed softly, and in the middle of it all, Michael took a slow step forward, then another. He reached the side of the bed, looked down at the tiny faces, his son, his daughter, and something in him broke open. He sank to his knees, buried his face in the Haley's lap, and wept. "I didn't know," he said through tears. "God, Haley, I didn't know." She touched his hair gently, her own eyes wet. "I wanted to protect you. From me. From this." Michael looked up at her, then at the children. "I don't want protection. I want them. I want you." He spent the rest of the day in that room, learning how to hold his babies, feeding them formula under Haley's tired gaze, promising quietly that he would never leave again. The next morning, he walked into his father's office holding a photo of the twins. Henry barely glanced up. "I need you to come with me," Michael said, repeating his mother's words. Henry frowned. "I'm in the middle of... now." There was something in his son's voice that stopped him. They drove in silence, and when they arrived at the estate Margaret had given Haley, Henry stepped into the living room with visible reluctance. Haley was there, holding the boy. The girl lay in a bassinet nearby. Henry stopped. Michael handed him the photo. "Your grandchildren." The older man stared at the image, then at the children. His face changed, not in one dramatic instant, but in small, slow cracks that spread through the polished shell he had worn for years. He stepped forward, touched the edge of the bassinet, then looked at Haley. "I didn't know," he said. Haley nodded but didn't speak. "I was wrong," he added, his voice shaking. He stayed longer than anyone expected, holding each child, asking their names, whispering things only they could hear. When he returned home, he sat in his armchair for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. Samantha's father answered. "The engagement is off," Henry said. "Do what you must." The news shattered the carefully built alliance between the Reeves and Green families. Samantha's father threatened lawsuits, pulled investments, made calls. But Henry didn't flinch. He had built a fortune once. He could do it again. What he couldn't rebuild was the time he'd already lost. When Samantha found out, she stormed into the mansion, hurling insults, tears streaming. She accused Michael of betrayal, of cowardice. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told her the truth, that he had never loved her and that he wasn't going to pretend anymore. She left that evening, and with her went the last thread tying Michael to a life he had never wanted. In the weeks that followed, the Reeves household changed. Margaret spent her days visiting Haley and the twins. Henry, quieter now, took long walks and sometimes stopped by unannounced, bringing books or flowers or simply silence. Michael moved into the house with Haley, helping with night feedings, changing diapers, learning lullabies. He resigned from his corporate role and began building something new, a company focused on community investments and ethical growth, something that mattered. Haley, still guarded, watched him slowly earn back the pieces of her heart. One morning, as the sun spilled across the nursery floor, she looked at him rocking their daughter and said, "I'm glad you came back." He looked up, his eyes full of quiet joy. "I never really left. I just had to find my way." And for the first time in the stillness of that room, surrounded by the sound of soft breathing and morning light, it felt like everything had finally come home. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Watch more of our stories and share this one with someone who needs to see it.